Powkiddy have been in the retro gaming handheld scene for years now, but the reputation is not up there with amzn and Retroid and even Mii U. However, is that fair? Are they just being overlooked? And today we're going to figure that out by checking out the Powkiddy X70, basically a knockoff Switch. Kick off your shoes and relax your socks while we figure out if the Powkiddy X70 is worth your money. Now, first things first, it's blatantly obvious that Powkiddy have designed the X70 to look pretty much identical to a Nintendo Switch. But have they focused more on the looks instead of the quality of the device? Well, spoiler alert, the Powkiddy X70 is not that great. However, there's a fantastic alternative that does everything the X70 wants to do, and you can get it for the same price. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a deeper look at the Powkiddy X70. Now, as soon as you get the Powkiddy X70 in your hands, straight away you can see the similarities to the Nintendo Switch in terms of size, color style, shape, but it pretty much ends there. Because once you get the Powkiddy X70 in your hands and start taking a closer look at it, you can instantly see and feel how flimsy this console is. It feels light in the hands, the plastic doesn't feel particularly good, the buttons are all clicky, like way too clicky. It doesn't have all the buttons you would expect from a Nintendo Switch, and the screen, although it's one of the biggest I've seen at this price range, just looks incredibly budget even before you switch it on. One thing that does feel nice, however, are the analog sticks. The analog sticks do feel quite nice to use. They're a nice shape, similar to the ones we see on amzn devices, and they move quite nicely, but they don't have L3 and R3 functionality, which is a huge issue, as we'll find out later on. Moving on, and around the console, we're pretty well covered, to be fair. We've got the standard 3.5mm audio jack, we've got a mini HDMI out, an SD card slot, standard volume and power buttons, but on the bottom side we also have a USB 3 for power. But funnily enough, we have micro USBs for extra controllers. So it looks like the Powkiddy X70 has tried to tick a lot of boxes in terms of being able to add peripherals, etc., but has maybe missed the mark a little bit. When we switch on the Powkiddy X70, the low quality of the screen is further reinforced. The colors don't look that great on it, and the plastic on it is overly reflective. And we're treated with a user interface that looks dated, but actually isn't that terrible. It's pretty simple and easy to use and gives you a lot of the options you'd want to see on a retro gaming handheld system. It could be simplified a lot more and maybe a lot of the visual noise reduced, but I don't want to be too harsh because although it's not the greatest and it definitely has its issues, the user interface didn't really bother me that much. Now, when we delve deeper into the user interface, we can start to find all the emulators that this console has, and it emulates consoles all the way up to PlayStation 1, which for the price of this console and current day standards is the minimum I would expect. But straight away we see a huge issue playing games on the Powkiddy X70, and that's because of the screen size and shape. Every single game is stretched, and there's no option to change the aspect ratio to a 4:3. And this is where I think Powkiddy really shows how much they've completely missed the point. They've clearly focused too much on trying to make the console physically look like a Nintendo Switch, even down to the screen shape and size, that they completely disregarded the fact that all the consoles the X70 can play need a 4:3 screen ratio. And for it to be forced into a widescreen aspect ratio without even giving an option of 4:3, even if you were going to be happy with borders, is a massive issue for me and really shows the issues behind Powkiddy's design choices and intent with this console. Moving on from the stretched screen issues, and things just don't get better. The sound on the Powkiddy X70 is probably the worst I've experienced on any retro gaming handheld device I've used. It's choppy, bitty, and sounds tinny. There's no consistency to it whatsoever, and when you can hear it, it just does not sound good. If we do look past the screen issues and the sound issues, the emulation itself is actually not that bad. The games, even PlayStation 1 games, run pretty smoothly on the Powkiddy X70. And this for me really shows what a missed opportunity this console was. One of the most important and potentially most difficult things to get right seems to be working, but it's completely marred by everything else around it, by all the design choices that Powkiddy made. Design choices which were clearly only made to make this system look like a Nintendo Switch, which for most retro gaming handheld enthusiasts is not a big thing, is not something we're going to be interested in. It definitely feels like this has been targeted more towards kids, but the price just doesn't seem to reflect that. Furthermore, considering the Powkiddy X70 emulates PlayStation 1 games, you would think it would at least cover all the buttons that it would need for a PlayStation 1, but it doesn't have an L2 and an R2 option, and not having the L3 and R3 clicky sticks makes it almost impossible to play PlayStation 1 games properly. Your only option is to try and map L2 and R2 to the start and select buttons. But the issue for me was the start and select buttons weren't working on the console I received. To make things even worse, although you can remap all the controls, you have to remap every single game. Changes you make aren't remembered for the console itself, they're only game specific. And this might not have been an issue if the buttons were already mapped pretty well for each console, meaning that you might just have one specific game that you'd wanted to map differently, and that could be quite useful. But that just wasn't the case. Every single PlayStation 1 game had the X and the circle buttons basically swapped around from what you would expect. So the lower button, which should have been X, was mapped to the right hand button, which should have been the circle. And although in maybe PlayStation 1 game menus this isn't a big issue, when you're playing things like racing games, it really is. I normally always like to look for the best in any of the retro gaming handhelds that I look at, because although we can be uber critical about these consoles these days, the reality is that we have these consoles in our hands that if you gave me one of these 10 years ago, it would have blown my mind. I would have dreamt of something like the consoles we can have these days. So I always try to approach them from the mindset of how enjoyable are they to use. And honestly, I'm struggling with the X70. I gave it a lot of time. I tried so many times to try and jump in and enjoy it. And although I did have a handful of enjoyable experiences, I was constantly aware of the issues of the screen stretching, of the bad audio, and of the clicky buttons as well. And when it came to trying to play PlayStation 1 games, I just couldn't really enjoy them at all, especially with the start and select issues. Some games I couldn't even start because my start and select buttons weren't working. Honestly, the best thing about this console for me has been the fact that I can just chuck it anywhere, chuck it on the couch, throw it on the table, not worry if it falls on the floor, let my 2-year-old daughter grab it whenever she wants and just let her do whatever she wants with it. But the only reason I feel like that is because I was provided this as a review copy. I didn't spend £100 on this, which is what you would have to spend if you wanted to get one. And if I'd spent £100 on this, I would not want to just give it to my kids to let them just throw it about and do whatever they want with. And that for me is the real issue. Powkiddy could have made the X70 something really special. They could have made it look like the Nintendo Switch without having to sacrifice in so many areas. They could have settled for just being a bit like it as opposed to trying to copy it in all the wrong ways. And if they'd managed to do that, I'd be happy to spend £100 on this. Or they could have gone down the path that they chose to go down. Make it look like a Nintendo Switch toy. Make it look like something that kids are going to want to grab. Something that parents will get for the kids just as a cheap toy to play with. But if you're going to do that, you've got to price it at the right price. No more than £20 in my eyes. And unfortunately, the Powkiddy X70 just misses in so many areas. However, if you are looking for a console that's around about £100, if not less, that can do everything the Powkiddy X70 should have been able to do, that can emulate games up to the PlayStation 1 brilliantly, with gorgeous screen, has all the buttons covered, you need to check out the RG35XX, because that is everything the Powkiddy X70 tried to be, or the Powkiddy X70 couldn't be, I should say. Between the RG35XX and the X70, there's no comparison in my eyes. If I had £100 and I wanted to spend it on a device that can emulate up to PS1, I would definitely pick the 35XX over the X70. But it's your choice to make. And for whichever console you're interested in, links to both of them will be in the description below. If you do want to find out more about the RG35XX, then check out this episode right here.